The room was silent, too silent for a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by noise, cameras, applause, and expectation. The glow of a single desk lamp cut through the darkness, illuminating scattered notes, half-finished thoughts, and a truth that had waited decades to surface. Just 1 minute ago, everything changed. Somewhere between memory and confession, Ron Howard found himself staring at a past he had carefully preserved but never fully confronted. Not as the child star the world adored, not as the award-winning director everyone respected, but as a man finally willing to say what had been buried beneath success. What did he see when he looked back? Was it pride, or was something far more complicated? Because sometimes the most devastating truths are not the ones the world hides from you, but the ones you hide from yourself. And now, after years of silence, the question lingers in the air. What exactly did Ron Howard just reveal, and why now? And in the quiet, where the cameras no longer define him, Ron Howard finally faces the one role he had been avoiding all along, being himself. The lights came first, bright, unwavering, almost blinding in their intensity, casting long shadows across a set designed to feel like home. To the audience, it was comforting, familiar, safe. But to a young boy standing just off-center, waiting for his cue, it was something else entirely. Expectation. Ron Howard was only a child when the world first learned his name. His face, soft, expressive, endlessly approachable, became a symbol of something audiences longed for. Simplicity, innocence, a version of life untouched by complication. On the Andy Griffith Show, he wasn't just acting, he was becoming. Scene after scene, take after take, he delivered exactly what was needed. A smile here, a curious glance there, laughter timed perfectly, emotion carefully measured. It all felt natural, but it wasn't effortless. Behind the camera, the world was quieter. There were pauses, moments between takes, where the energy dropped and the room shifted. Adults spoke in low voices. Directors adjusted angles. Scripts were rewritten. And Ron waited, not as a child, but as a performer. His parents, both experienced in the industry, guided him gently but firmly. They believed in structure, discipline, professionalism. And Ron followed. He learned quickly, faster than most, because in that world, learning wasn't optional, it was survival. And so, he became dependable, reliable, perfect. But perfection has a cost. Late at night, after the lights dimmed and the applause faded into memory, there were moments, small, almost invisible, where something felt off. Not wrong, just incomplete. He couldn't name it yet. He didn't have a language, only the feeling, a quiet question forming somewhere deep beneath the surface. Is this me, or just what they need me to be? The audience never saw that part. They saw the smile. They trusted it. And maybe that was the hardest part of all. Because the more the world believed in that image, the harder it became to step outside of it. Time moved forward, as it always does. Episodes aired. Fame grew. Recognition followed him everywhere. But internally, something remained still, unchanged, unresolved. Waiting. And as the applause grew louder, filling every corner of his world, one thought began to echo more clearly than the rest. What happens if the smile fades? Adolescence doesn't arrive gently. For most, it's a gradual shift, a slow unfolding of identity. But for Ron Howard, it came like a spotlight snapping back on. Only this time, the expectations had changed. The industry was watching, not with admiration, but with curiosity. Child stars rarely transitioned smoothly. The very qualities that made them beloved often became limitations. And Ron could feel it. The subtle shift in tone, the unspoken question lingering in every meeting. Can he become something more? Or is this where it ends? He continued working, moving into roles that attempted to bridge the gap between childhood and adulthood. But something felt different now. The scripts were heavier, the performances more scrutinized, and the smiles less certain. Off camera, Ron began to withdraw. Not dramatically, not noticeably. But internally, the shift was undeniable. He spent more time observing, watching directors, studying how stories were built rather than just performed. It was control, something he hadn't fully had before. While others his age explored rebellion, Ron chose precision, structure, discipline. He enrolled in film school, quietly stepping into a new world, one where he wasn't the center of attention. And for the first time, that felt right. But even this new path came with questions. Was he stepping forward or stepping away? Was this growth or escape? The silence returned, but it had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with thought, reflection, uncertainty. Moments passed where he would sit alone, reviewing scenes, analyzing choices, questioning everything. Not just the work, but himself. Who was he becoming? And more importantly, who had he been all along? The industry didn't pause for answers. It never does. Opportunities came. Decisions had to be made. And then one quiet choice, almost invisible at the time, shifted everything. He stepped behind the camera, not as an experiment, but as a beginning. And though it felt like freedom, he had no idea what it would cost him to truly understand why. The first thing Ron Howard noticed about directing was the silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of control. Behind the camera, no one expected him to smile on cue. No one asked him to preserve an image frozen in time. The pressure was still there, but it had transformed into something sharper, more intellectual. Here, he could shape the story instead of being trapped inside it. And for a while, that felt like freedom. Sets became his sanctuary. The movement of crew members, the hum of equipment, the low conversations before a scene rolled. Everything carried a rhythm he understood instinctively. He studied emotion the way other directors studied lighting. He watched people carefully, their pauses, their fears, their hidden fractures. Because somewhere deep inside, Ron had spent his entire life learning how to hide his own. The transition surprised Hollywood. Many assumed the former child actor would fade quietly into nostalgia, remembered only as a familiar face from another era. Instead, Ron Howard rebuilt himself piece by piece, film by film, and the industry noticed. Success came steadily, then massively. Acclaim followed him again, but this time it sounded different. Critics no longer spoke about charm or innocence. They spoke about vision, discipline, emotional intelligence. His films carried humanity inside them. Even in stories built on spectacle, there was always something intimate underneath, a loneliness, a struggle, a search for meaning. Perhaps because he understood those things too well. But success has a strange way of disguising pain. The higher Ron climbed, the more polished his public image became. Calm, professional, grounded, the dependable filmmaker everyone trusted. He carried himself with stability in an industry built on instability. Yet beneath that calmness, another truth lingered quietly. He was still performing. Only now, the performance was subtler. No longer the smiling child. Now the composed director. The reliable professional. The man who always seemed in control. Years passed quickly. Awards lined shelves. Premieres blurred together. Interviews repeated the same questions, the same stories, the same carefully rehearsed reflections on success. But late at night, when the noise disappeared and the world finally became still, Ron sometimes found himself staring into silence again. Not at his career, at himself. Because achievement had solved many things. But not everything. Memories returned unexpectedly. The studio lights from childhood. The pressure to remain lovable. The quiet emotional discipline he had developed so young that it no longer felt unnatural. There were moments he barely remembered emotionally living through. Entire years spent adapting, evolving, surviving expectations. And slowly, a realization began to form. Maybe he had become so skilled at being who others needed him to be that he no longer knew where the performance ended. The thought unsettled him, not dramatically, quietly, like a crack spreading beneath the surface of something long considered stable. Then came the interviews, the reflections, the conversations that forced him to revisit the past, not as nostalgia, but as truth. And somewhere during those moments, something shifted inside him. The carefully managed distance between who he was and what he felt began to collapse. For decades, he had narrated stories about human struggle. Now, whether he intended to or not, he was beginning to confront his own. And as the cameras rolled once again, capturing an older Ron Howard in reflective silence, one reality became impossible to ignore. The hardest story he would ever tell was the one about himself. Age changes memory, not by erasing it, but by sharpening certain moments until they become impossible to avoid. For Ron Howard, the past had always existed in fragments. Studio lights, smiles, schedules, interviews, endless movement, a life so carefully structured that there had rarely been time to stop and ask what any of it truly meant. But eventually, stillness arrives for everyone. And in stillness, buried truths become louder. The revelation did not come through scandal or collapse. There was no explosive headline waiting in the shadows. No dramatic public unraveling. What emerged instead was something quieter, far more human, and perhaps far more devastating. Awareness. During interviews and personal reflections later in life, Ron began speaking differently about his past. The words were measured, thoughtful, almost cautious. But underneath them was something unmistakable: exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying identities for so long that they begin to fuse together. The child star, the actor, the director, the industry professional, the stable public figure. Each role had protected him in some way. Each had helped him survive a system that demanded constant adaptation. But survival and understanding are not the same thing. And Ron was beginning to understand that. He spoke about pressure, not dramatically but honestly. The pressure to remain emotionally composed. The pressure to never become another tragic Hollywood story. The pressure to navigate fame while appearing untouched by it. For years, people admired how grounded he seemed. What they never realized was how much effort that groundedness required. Because behind discipline often lies fear. Fear of collapse. Fear of failure. Fear of becoming unrecognizable to the people who once loved you. As these reflections deepened, Ron revisited memories differently. Moments that once seemed ordinary now carried emotional weight he hadn't fully processed at the time. The smiles had been real, but so had the loneliness. The success had been real, but so had the pressure. And perhaps the most painful realization of all was this: he had spent decades mastering emotional control without ever fully asking himself what those emotions actually were. The cameras captured an older man speaking calmly about his life. But beneath the calmness was grief, not for lost fame or fading relevance, but for time itself, for the years spent performing stability, for the child who learned professionalism before emotional understanding, for the younger version of himself who kept moving forward because stopping simply wasn't an option. And yet, there was no bitterness in him, only clarity, a quiet acceptance that success does not erase struggle. It only makes it easier for others to overlook it. As the interviews continued, audiences began to see him differently, not as a Hollywood success story polished to perfection, but as a human being shaped by pressure, expectation, discipline, and silence. The revelation wasn't about scandal. It was about cost. The invisible emotional cost of being watched for an entire lifetime. And in that honesty, something remarkable happened. The distance between Ron Howard and the audience disappeared. For the first time, he no longer seemed like an untouchable figure from Hollywood history. He seemed vulnerable, real. And as the silence settled after one final reflection, a question lingered quietly in the air. If a man can spend his entire life becoming who the world expects, what happens when he finally turns around and asks who he is without them? The noise eventually fades. The premieres end. The interviews slow down. The applause that once felt permanent becomes distant, like echoes from another lifetime. And somewhere within that silence, Ron Howard began to find something he had unknowingly searched for all along. Not recognition, not achievement, peace. It arrived slowly, not through dramatic transformation, but through reflection, through acceptance, through the understanding that a life does not need to be perfect to be meaningful. For decades, Ron Howard had existed inside carefully constructed roles. Some were written by Hollywood, others were written by expectation, and many were written by himself. But now, standing at a different point in life, those identities no longer felt like prisons. They felt like chapters. The child actor who learned discipline too early. The young man terrified of fading away. The director who built control out of uncertainty. The public figure who mastered composure. All of them were real. All of them mattered. And perhaps that realization changed everything. Because the story was never about whether fame damaged him completely or whether success saved him. Reality was more complicated than that. Fame gave him opportunities, purpose, identity, and extraordinary achievement. But it also demanded emotional sacrifices few people could fully understand from the outside. Now older, Ron seemed less interested in preserving mythology. He spoke with a softness that comes only after years of internal negotiation. The need to appear flawless had faded. In its place was honesty. Not dramatic honesty. Human honesty. The kind that arrives when someone finally stops trying to outrun their own reflection. There were still moments of sadness. Certain memories still carried weight. Certain questions remained unanswered. But he no longer seemed afraid of those uncertainties. That was the difference. For much of his life, control had been survival. Now acceptance became freedom. The cameras that once defined him no longer held the same power. He had spent decades telling stories about resilience, fear, ambition, isolation, and redemption. Only now did it become clear that he had quietly been telling fragments of his own story the entire time. Every film, every character, every emotional conflict, pieces of himself hidden in plain sight. And perhaps that is the final irony of Ron Howard's journey. The man who dedicated his life to understanding human stories spent years struggling to fully understand his own. Yet in the end, he did something rare. He faced it, not with spectacle, not with collapse, but with reflection. The final image is not one of tragedy. It is quieter than that. A man sitting alone in silence, not consumed by the past anymore, but finally willing to sit beside it without fear. No performance, no expectation, no role left to play, just Ron Howard. And in that stillness, after a lifetime spent being watched by millions, he finally confronts the one person he could never step away from, himself. The room remains silent, but this time, the silence no longer feels empty.